Thank you all for joining us and for all of our guests. So why don't we go ahead and just go right into our work group updates. Jessica, if you could lead us through those.
Absolutely. All right, so our first update is going to be from the potency work group. And so I will go ahead and hand that over to our potency work group lead.
Hey Jess, this is Anastasia. I just wanted to let you know Mike's going to be running a little bit late. So if we can just move him to the bottom of the work group updates, Ryan will be our first presenter.
Okay, perfect. Ryan, go ahead and if you're ready, go ahead and pull your slides up.
Yeah, give me 1 second to get everything squared away here. Get my mic on, video going. Everyone can see my fun Mariners t-shirt. Oh, and it's going to give you the background of my home office. Give me. Hey, every single platform has a different virtual background that I have to set independently. So let's try.
We get to see your fish this way, though.
No, they're kind of at an angle, and the lights are off. All right, there we go. Let's see, audio visual. Share my screen. Oh my goodness. Screen 1, it'll probably show videos. So, all right. That's not what I wanted. Going on the wrong screen. Give me 1 second. As you guys can tell, I'm so prepared to be moved to the front.
We did put you on the spot there, so.
Yeah, so let me stop sharing. How the heck do I do that? Stop sharing. There we go. Let's try this again.
And I did, just a reminder that we are recording this session. I did send a chat to all the attendees, but sorry, not to the panelists as well.
Okay, all right, is everyone seeing slide number 1 here?
Yep, looks good, Ryan.
Perfect, thank you. All right, now that I've got all my ducks in a row here. Afternoon, everyone. Hope we're all having a good Friday, and I'm going to use this opportunity to make my shameless Go Mariners plug. So the mycotoxin group has had one meeting and several email communications since our last steering committee meeting. Through those communications, both a motion and a couple items we want to bring to this steering committee's attention. So to start off, what we really wanted to focus on is, or just to remind everyone, the way we decided to tackle mycotoxins is the ELISA stuff was going to be handled by Ray's work group after they wrap up the microbial analysis recommendations, and then my team would handle the instrumental LCMS setup. So with that being said, primarily, or to our knowledge, laboratories that are analyzing mycotoxins not by the ELISA technologies are using liquid chromatography mass spec. Right now, very few labs are using this, primarily due to the cost of the instrumentation. So right off the bat, there's already a pretty limited market for this. While working through our discussions, many of the methods we found are provided by the specific instrument manufacturer and are not complete methods, as like accreditation will add it, where it includes all your QC checks that are both quarterly, yearly, daily. Typically, it's just the instrument parameters and software setup, which can be pretty different from instrument to instrument. And again, on top of that, including the cost, most labs are utilizing ELISA methodologies for their mycotoxins. So I know that's not necessarily the highlight of the work group, but I do want to bring up the conversation we had because it's pretty important. The ELISA kits have a lot of pros and cons to them. They're much more affordable than the LCMS option when labs don't already have one. Typically, the procedures outline how to handle client samples, but not outline specific QC. For example, one of the kits we brought up was from Romer. And there's a statement in there that states, Romer Labs strongly recommends to do a full validation, including 3 extracts at a blank low, mid, and high spike level for each matrix prior to testing any unknown samples. So by this definition, if a lab is not conducting if a lab is choosing to not conduct a piece or all of that recommendation, the results are really into question a little bit on if they're actually truly quantitative. And since this seems to be the norm with mycotoxin analysis in this case, using these kits, many of them mention, or either in their own validation that is provided or in the procedure themselves, confirmation via LCMS. So from the work group discussed, this need for confirmation kind of throws some shadow on the quantitative value these methods provide, and there's a lot of concerns of false negatives going into the market, because the best practice would often be to only confirm your positive hits. So whether you're doing that internally with your own LCMS or you're subbing that out, or you end up subbing that out. Very critical to note in the future market, if that's going to be something that goes on where you confirm your hits in-house using a different methodology, that would be a separate accreditation that would need to be required. So, which might just make the best business practice for labs to cut out the middleman and either move all their mycotoxin analysis to LCMS if they have one, or look to sub it out to a sister lab that can. If the labs want to send out samples for confirmation, unfortunately, the current traceability system doesn't allow for this, and this presents, in our opinion, or in my opinion, one of 3 options, one of 2 options. Option 1, labs continue to not be able to sub out mycotoxin confirmation samples, which therefore necessitates only allowing LCMS utilization, which would probably also require mycotoxins to no longer be one of the tests that's required just for you to simply be a lab, as my understanding is the current case. Or option 2, labs are allowed to sub out confirmation, or are able to sub out confirmation of their ELISA kits. But this kind of still sidesteps the issue mentioned on the full quantitative validity of these ELISA methodologies. So the last thing we talked about was similar to our residual solvents motion in April. We just kind of wanted to recommend clarification of the WAC 315-55-102 list of mycotoxins, including CAS numbers, identifying exactly how those aflatoxins and ochratoxins, which specific ones, so that the labs know exactly what specific mycotoxins to buy standards for and which ones accreditation needs to have put into their database when we get to that point. Again, no formal motion, just kind of wanted, it's a discussion that came up out of the work group and just be a recommendation at this point. So that being said, to the motion. So what we'd like to present is utilization of the pesticide PDP or mycotoxin analyses. And once I'm done with this slide, we can go ahead and switch to the motion itself. But why did we pick the PDP? It's already a task force approved validation procedure. Like I said earlier, very few labs are actually utilizing LCMS technologies for their mycotoxin analyses. And due to the expensive cost of one, unless a lab already has one, very likely for their pesticide analysis, they would need to follow the PDP for anyway. Majority of labs would gravitate towards the ELISA methodologies anyways. So although the point of the PDP when we were working on it is not to force any particular specific instrument, the discussion in the work group and other conversations is that it just seems to be that an LCMS, specifically a tandem LCMS, so LCMS triple quad, is really the only way you can achieve the achieve the detection levels we need in our state. So again, why, oh shoot, too many. Why the tandem MS? So technically speaking, whenever we've been talking about this, that's the instrumentation we've been talking about. So they're typically utilized when analyzing for large organic compounds, such as mycotoxins, where the instrument has a second mass spec to break the initial compound. So the initial compound is broken down in the first chamber into what are called quant ions or parent ions, and then there's another mass spec chamber that breaks them apart into what are called daughter ions. And this provides the ability to further differentiate target very large, chemically large organic compounds from a complex matrix that might have a lot of similar sized or even in possibly as well as enantiomers, separate them from each other so we can get really good, accurate, low-level results. So the pros to this, it gives the labs a lot of flexibility to combine their mycotoxin and pesticide analysis into the same extraction and instrument run. However, this is not intended to be a requirement. The PDP has also been approved for analysis of pesticides in cannabis, which would just allow labs to apply the accepted PDP model to their mycotoxin analysis, whether they are running them currently with their pesticides or not. Many ELISA mycotoxin test kits recommend or require confirmation of positive detections, and tangentially, a lot of them are not developed specifically for or, validated on cannabis and hemp or cannabis products. So in that scenario where a lab is analyzing them via ELISA kits as like a screen, I guess, and then moving on to LCMS to confirm, if you're going to report those data, if you're going to report those from the two separate runs to the system, regardless of why and how, you need to have two separate accreditations, which would kind of double the accreditation cost to a laboratory. So, and another pro is after purchasing the LCMS equipment and it's all paid off, the cost of the lab per sample via this methodology would be quite cheaper than your per sample of ELISA kits, according to what the work group members had discussed. So lastly, the cons, kind of like I said, if they don't currently own an LCMS, it's a pretty significant investment. And there is some concern that we mentioned in the lab that the PDP might have too wide of a very acceptable variance limits when developing the detection limits on what is and isn't applicable. And hopefully Mike can elaborate a little bit more on this because he's kind of the PDP expert. There's just a little bit of concern that the 5 ppb detection limits for the aflatoxins might need some further refinement on the acceptance limits when you're validating those low levels. So that being said, that's all I have for my presentation. I will go ahead and stop sharing. Anastasia, if you could pull up my motion, my work group's motion, that would be perfect. And we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, Ryan, before I was just going to say, before we get into the motion, let's see if folks have questions, but you kind of just said that. So yeah. And does anyone have any questions for Ryan? And you can go ahead and just start talking if you're unable to raise your hand there.
I'm curious if you've seen a difference in the results from LCMS labs versus ELISA labs in the quantity of that are being reported.
I have not seen those personally. I think that would probably be a question for LCB if they're comfortable speaking to that, because I haven't seen the specifically those differences.
Mainly, I'm curious because we don't see a whole lot of failures on the mycotoxin front, and a lot of those failures can be attributed to interferences with CBD. And once you use cleanup columns, then they go away. So, I'm curious if the LCMS folks are seeing more failures than the ELISA folks. And if not, then wouldn't that justify getting rid of mycotoxin testing altogether if we're not seeing failures across the industry.
Yeah, this is Amber Wise, and I was going to sort of mention a similar point, I guess, and I was a little hesitant because I was sort of assuming that the answer was going to be we're not changing any rules or that's outside the scope of this discussion group, but I would sort of concur that I have been to a scientific presentation a couple of years ago from somebody out of Oregon who screened, I don't know, hundreds, if not thousands of samples of cannabis and concentrates, and there just really doesn't seem to be any mycotoxins in cannabis products. And in my opinion, the most danger for mycotoxin exposure in cannabis products is in edibles, which is not currently required. So to me, it's the testing requirement is sort of backwards, but I assume that's probably outside the scope of this work group.
Thanks, Amber, for that. I think you hit that spot on. I think we're not talking about what the product standards should be, but that may be a question down the road. A good thing to keep in mind. I think we're just talking about, given that that is a regulated item, what should be how should we be testing for it?
And just to clarify, this motion doesn't preclude the use of ELISA currently. If I'm remembering correctly, Ryan, you said that Raymond's group is going to be focusing on the rule set for that.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure I did the work group did an adequate job representing the discussion we had, because we did have a pretty lively discussion in our work group that's kind of similar to what I think we're having right now. So I just wanted to make sure it was reflected.
Ryan, this is Kendra. Just again, we haven't gotten into the guts fully of the motion, but again, this would really be that if using an LCMS for the analysis of mycotoxins, then this would be the method, right? The adapted USDA PDP validation procedures.
Correct. That's the intent. If the wording is in a way that doesn't reflect that perfectly, I'm more than open to that. That's just that is the intent. We're not requiring LCMS. We're just saying if that's the procedures people want to, or if that's the instrumentation labs want to use, here's what we recommend.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
All right. Well, if we've answered all the questions, I think we should go ahead and just jump right into the motion.
Okay, so let me then ask if there is someone who would like to make this motion.
Sorry, this is Amber. Before we do that, can I just make a clarification? Did we not vote to make LCMS a mycotoxin requirement previously? Am I misremembering that?
That is not to my knowledge
Okay.
as the work group lead.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I will go ahead and to accept this motion as written.
Is there a second?
I will second.
Thank you, Jeff. Amber for making the motion, Jeff for seconding. All those in favor, please take yourselves off of mute and say aye.
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 Anyone opposed, please take yourself off of mute and say nay. Okay, motion passes. Good
Great.
job, Ryan.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and we'll move on to our next agenda item. Let's see. We're going to put Mike at the end. Which work group update do we have next, Anastasia? Over.
I think it's microbial, Jess. It's Ray.
Oh, thank you. There we go. I had to flip back over to the agenda. All right, so we'll go ahead and hand it over to Raymond for the microbial work group update.
Anastasia, all I have, I don't have any slides, so it'll just be the motion, but I'll give you guys just the verbal update. We've met, I can't remember last time we had an actual steering committee meeting. We've had at least one meeting, potentially two, depending on the dates. All's been well, and we've scheduled the next, I think, 4 meetings. I think we're scheduled up through November, so hopefully all members can make it for those meetings. The last meeting I outlined that we had kind of switched gears and went from doing the presence absence of Salmonella E. coli, which we were doing before our steering committee kind of stepped away for a month or two during the summer, and we switched gears and started tackling the quantifying Enterobacteriaceae, or I think what's it is, the gram-negative biotolerant organisms. So that leads us to the motion. Before I go into the motion, I didn't cover too much, but any questions or?
Hi, this is Bobby of Confidence in for Nick here. The checklist that I was looking at here says as a specific call out for 3M Petrofilm.
Mm-hmm.
Does this standard have allowances or alternatives for the 3M Petrofilm, in the event of something like supply chain disruption?
Yeah, that's where that's actually outlined in this as one of the cons of this motion itself. So I guess we can hop right into it. But yeah, one of the downfalls of what we found within this checklist. So the checklist itself, is from is what our Washington State Department of Agriculture utilizes for their milk testing. And it specifically does outline using the 3M Petrifilm, and that's where the checklist is outlined towards. Let's take it as that is. To the steering committee and seeing how we go about this. They are linked for the most part hand in hand, because the checklist or methodology is provided by the National Conference of Interstate Milk Shipments. Does specifically reference the 3M apparatus. It's all tied together, so that's how we'll say.
So to that point, Rain, this is Kendra, and connected to Bobby's question, and from an outside, not in the lab perspective, my understanding is basically Petrofilm is a brand name, right? It's not a generic. It is a specific brand name, and I do think for the purposes here for passing motions, we want to talk about the function that needs to be performed rather than tying into a specific brand. So my question would be, knowing that this, is the method and, designed around what WSDA does, what is the function that this Petrofilm performs? And again, to the question, is there an analog to it, right?
So there, from my knowledge and from what I've heard from the group, there are alternatives where we know, or in our discussions, I think I spoke to Sarah about this, and we had a feeling this would come up. The mention of Petrifilm, it is a brand, it's a specific, trademark from 3M. The functionality of it, again, I'm not 100% familiar with all of it, and I have found a few alternatives to it that are for other companies, but it's essentially a auger plate that is on a film that can actually, it'll select for the targets that we're looking for, so the gram-negative biotolerant organism, and you can actually visualize them from there. Other makers do have that. Where we came from is finding the quality. We focused a little more on the method, but there's also quality systems that are built into the NCIMS, the national conference behind it all, where we can totally kind of encompasses all of the kind of where we aim for is that we could present the steering committee with more of the whole system, but it does tie to 3M. So poorly worded there, so I can elaborate more and try to put it in a better phrase, but
yeah. So my encouragement would be, it sounds like kind of the general steps for the work group members made sense, right? For the method steps and the validation.
Yep.
And the concern again just is being super locked into a brand for logistics or other purposes. And a note just came up in the chat on, and also whether that Petrofilm has been validated in the cannabis matrix. So to that end, I wonder if it's helpful again in moving this motion forward to add some language. And I know maybe this is not the right place to do all of that, just simply to state that there will be adaptations that will be considered to account for non-brand specific analogs, as long as the steps, right, and the method remain the same. That is my suggestion.
Anastasia, can you scroll back up to the top? Because I think that line has been put in the.
Is it there? So is it the intention that there will be a separate motion coming to adapt that?
Yes. And there will be, so where we're at is that we identified we've identified Petrofilm as being, because it's tied to the NCIMS. So if we, per your recommendation, what we do is basically eliminate the Petrofilm aspect of it and utilize, we spoke about it in our group to make it a broad spectrum of just, utilizing a similar apparatus to it. Where we got tied to is that adapting, our next process, our next step that we've been working on via meeting, and I've asked them to continue on their own, is adapting this 2400A Petrofilm checklist to fit for cannabis. We can adapt it to basically, it's still written as a Petrofilm checklist, so we can adapt it that way as well. And then there's also an additional piece, which I don't know if it's in one of the pros benefits of it, is there's a general checklist that is more for just bacteriology that identifies more quality systems pieces that go into a microbiology office or laboratory.
Okay.
So that would come in a later motion as well.
Okay. And as I understand it, the NCIMS kind of, which is our overarching, right, link here about the checklist and protocol, is it true that that particular protocol actually already has alternatives possible within its?
That's correct. So that NCIMS document has 4 or 5 different films that are similar apparatus, similar testing method written in there. That is correct.
Okay. So the checklist protocol already has some possible alternatives, it sounds like, that we could explore. And again, right now the Petrofilm is unique and just technically what the lab is more, the state lab is most familiar with right now around the 3M Petrofilm.
That's right. And we have 2 other laboratories on the committee as well, or on the work group, and they are familiar with it as well.
Okay.
I think the Petrofilm is pretty well the industry standard, but locking us into it for reasons already talked about, COVID and price increases and all that, being able to make our own agar could start to make financial sense to a lot of us. So having that option available is pretty important.
Yeah, so to that end, what I'm trying to maybe figure out is to honor the work and this motion that's coming forward, but not to pass a motion that maybe we don't want to be that specific about Petrofilm. I see we'll have adaptations in a separate motion, but I'm just pondering that right now.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Kendra. I'm saying the same thing, I think.
Might note as well that that 3M themselves reference petrofilm as an alternative to other methods. And outside of this checklist, they see that inherently as one form or one method.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, there's nothing real special about it, right? It's a particular proprietary auger that they've made, and we could make the same thing in our own labs.
Question here for someone who is not a chemist nor understands this language. The Petrofilm brand item, is there, if somebody were to make an alternative, how would you know whether or not it was good enough to do the job?
So me not ever utilizing these. So what is the idea behind the Petrofilm is that I guess the proprietary piece of it is a very thin layer. It's an auger without actually having an actual, see in a science class of like an actual Petri dish with an auger that's poured in there that you would actually have to, there's depth to it. This Petrofilm is a very thin layer where it's, and they can incorporate a few different things that are highlighted here, where there's grid lines, a few other pieces. So it's ease of use, and it's a little more standardized. Having an actual auger plate isn't it? The auger that they utilize in this film, this thin film, can be made, commercially or within a laboratory. That's to my knowledge. I'd be curious to speak to the work group, but as I understand it, it is a pretty standard auger that can be made in a normal, in a more traditional way.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest reason I can see that Petrofilm is so prevalent is just like you said, Raymond, the ease of its use. It's stupid easy to use it.
One thing that a point I'd like to make really quick. Go ahead, Annette, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, I mean, where I was kind of going with my question was, are there some criteria I was thinking of that could be in the place of the Petrofilm that Petrofilm would meet, but some key critical criteria so that if it was met by a different product would then do the same job. I don't know if that's possible. That was where I was going.
Yeah, so I think sorry, and I was going to say, I think to your point, kind of that connection was that in this National Conference of Interstate Checklist Protocol, apparently there are already alternatives within this protocol that's being sourced for our baseline that use other than Petrofilm. So there clearly has been some work done already to provide other valid alternatives to Petrofilm in the protocol itself, is my understanding.
One thing I'd like to say is that it's very common when we're developing methods or when we're writing standard operating procedures that we reference specific equipment, and I'm thinking of different things like probes that we use in water bodies, or for lab folks, things like InterAlert and fecal alert, or some of those Quanti-Tray type products. So I don't think it is necessarily a bad thing or unusual to identify a specific item like this, to be identifying the Petrofilm. And the other thing I was thinking about is, with this being tied to milk testing, and milk testing being, milk being heavily tested, I don't think there's a risk there. So I don't know. That's just a few of my thoughts. I'd be interested to hear what Ray thinks of that. kind of off base or.
The in regards to having it be this is geared towards milk at this point, or the way we have it, and then how does that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking, I don't think we'll run into a situation where it's not available because it's so heavily tested. And I don't think it's a bad thing to have a specific brand mentioned, because we do that all the time with just in science with, you know, specific brands where we identify those and that's the standard, and, you know, we have methods for those specific items.
So in regards to
Yeah.
that, I would say, from just being at the DOH, I think, forgive me if I'm getting the name wrong, but I think Jeff mentioned it as well with COVID and everything. We are running into some issues getting materials in, but at the same time, you know, I would agree with you, Jess, that given how prevalent the testing is, it should be available. The idea of it being, I do agree with you, Jess, that referring to a certain piece for a protocol, you know, defining what it is, whether it be equipment or actual materials used, seems pretty standard. To address what Kendra mentioned a few times in regards to the checklist, the checklist itself does refer to a handful of different 3M Petrifilm systems as well. They're just not geared towards the aerobic or coliform count. So it's more of a target-based piece, but they're still utilizing 3M technology.
Okay, thanks.
One thing I was going to add, and I don't know the science necessarily behind this, but if we are truly trying to make inter-lab test results agree with each other, having another brand be used could change the way that these test results end up being counted or whatever. My understanding of microbiology is very limited. I'm going to say that now, but if you have different agar mixtures or different nutrient mixtures in that agar, you can get different growth rates. And so calling out a specific brand might actually be better in this case to make things more consistent. But I'm going to couch all of that with saying I don't know if other brands are exactly consistent with this one or not.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So I would offer that maybe to hear from Department of Ag, because if these, our recommendations are intended to eventually become part of the rules, and whether or not having something that's specific in rule is if there are any issues with there, or maybe LCB has. Maybe that's the genesis of this discussion.
This is really the only piece that kind of makes me uncomfortable with the conversation, is this kind of lock into a single brand in such a named way. That as far as like other methods, like you QC other methods the same way. You can create validations. We just, as you brought up, have to establish what the criteria are.
And Anastasia or Ray, on this, could you scroll down to a little bit further on the document? Does it list out the quality control criteria here for us, or where would we know what is the quality control criteria?
I believe it should be linked in the package insert, which is referred to. Should have them in. Dig that out if
Okay, so part of the reason I'm asking that is it's been mentioned to me that possibly if the quality control criteria, right, is solid, that maybe the focus is not so much, the brand name is less important. But making sure there's quality control criteria is where the emphasis on this method is stronger, right? That there might be possible adaptations in the future that no matter the adaptation, right, the criteria for quality control still has to be solid no matter what.
And going to Amber's point, do we know how much variability we would be introducing by not having some kind of a standard? Maybe it's not the quality control, but it's a standardization of the materials. Just a brainstorming here.
I mean, I don't disagree that validation here is key. I mean, I think that for a lot of the analytes that we've talked about, basically, you know, if you're using something other than Petrifilm, which even with Petrifilm, you should be doing validations with it. I mean, as long as you can pass a PT, as long as you're proving that your agar that you're making in-house is, you know, might not have the same growth rate, but you can quantify it through validation procedures. I think that's a stronger method than, you know, locking us in. But again, I mean, locking us into Petrifilm, as far as I know, everybody's using it. You guys can probably confirm or deny that. It's mostly just if a lab was to choose to then, you know, go a different route, do we have that option? And I think that, you know, there's no reason why we shouldn't, because we can create similar products in the lab. And we just need to show that obviously they work.
Yeah, I'm on the fence as well myself about choosing a specific brand, and then also agreeing with the point I made earlier of making it more consistent. So I'm not, you know, I think potentially some more guidance from a government body to see how common this is would be useful.
It's a good point. One other thing, you know, just to consider is if we were going more the validation route, that would be another role for the ICT.
I mean, I think at this point, you guys know my perspective on validation versus prescribed methods. I'd always like to see validated methods over prescribed, but that's just my opinion personally. It'll give us more flexibility in the lab.
Given all of that discussion, are there any does anybody want to recommend changes to this motion to
I actually have one recommendation right off the bat. Is there any way that we can get this 2400A-4 Petrifilm form emailed out to the group? I'm trying to access it on the NCIMS website, and I can't actually download I've got it here. I just click on it. It doesn't do anything. So can we get that emailed out? Is that possible? And then maybe table this till the next meeting, and then, you know, give us a little bit better informed decision on what we're voting on.
let me check in with Ray.
Yeah, email it. Should I just email it to Anastasia and
Sure.
distribute
She's
it
got
after? Okay.
She's got the whole distribution list. Let me just check in with you on the timing piece. Was a decision on this, is it going to slow you down? Is this something you needed an answer on? Or is this something that we can table without consequences until next month?
So we have begun kind of adapting, for the most part, we've begun adapting this checklist to fit within cannabis. Everything's written as milk to adapt to, with everyone's input from the work group for cannabis. I could be mistaken if it seems like the ultimate piece that we're hung up on is the Petri film aspect and locking us into one certain.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. So it.
Adapt. This leads us to, this is similar to how the only other motion we have, which is just getting us to some sort of a general broad methodology. This is written a little more specific, so I can broaden it out to being and present it at the next one as a more broad piece that, with input, I'd like to hear from steering committee if that's the wrong way of going about it, but I can present a motion that's a little less prescriptive of Petri film, but I still believe that that checklist still could be utilized as to create some sort of quality systems that are built upon this testing for the biotolerant gram-negative.
I would recommend that we pass it as is. And the reason I say that is, with the steering committee winding down, and we have, this is something that the Petri film is something that everyone is using. And as I mentioned, it's not uncommon to mention specific name brands in science like that when, there's something that everyone uses that works well. So that would be my recommendation. Just, if it's already widely used, if it fits, that's what I'm thinking. But
So in recognizing for timeline, right, a month out for a meeting and to have 2 motions come back from this group that would, one, be more broad and also present the adaptations on the checklist. I think after this conversation, we'll have the form out that all of us can review. I'm not thinking that it'll go much past that. And I don't think for me, I'm not hearing that it delays the additional work that the work group can do between now and having this motion plus the additional adaptation motion at the next meeting.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm expecting that the 2400A-4 form actually answers all of our questions, and once I read through it, my uncomfortability should disappear. I just want to read through it first, though.
And we do also have this part at the end about adaptations coming later. This is the other piece to remember.
So Kendra, you are recommending just to table it and deliver it as a package at the next meeting. And Jessica, you're thinking let's keep them separated and see what we can, where we can get on this one. I guess those are the 2 options.
I think that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think Nick is still with us if he wants to weigh in on that. I don't see Brad. But maybe Allison could weigh in on that as well.
This is Allison at Health. I mean, I wonder if tabling this for now wouldn't really cause much of a holdup down the road. But I mean, I think it would be fine to wait and just kind of read it through a little bit better, because I definitely understand the concerns. So, and if we can read through it and kind of mitigate those before it's passed, that seems worth it.
Okay, thanks for that. Just looking down the list. Are there other steering committee members that haven't yet voiced on this that would like to?
For my part, I'll say that supply chain disruptions over the last year and a half, I think, have taught us that tying ourselves to a single vendor, probably not a good idea. My lab doesn't currently use Petrofilm, but I think we would switch to doing so based on the direction. But I would like to have alternatives in the event that.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that it might be best to table this for now and bring it back with the checklist as a package. But I would ask Ray to think about Amber's point about introducing variability to this with the generic language that you'll be thinking of. It may be difficult to come up with generic language, but maybe the generic language would have to, introducing the variability because of the auger that's used or how it's processed or that does seem like it might introduce something important here. So if it's not everyone has to use Petrofilm, maybe everyone has to use the same thing, whatever that is, generically, whether it's defined by the ICT or something else. But there might be a way to thread that needle a little bit to get us to a place where we can. This does it. This will do it. To Jessica's point, this will get us where we need to be. But if we do get stuck, given that this will likely be something in rule, then it will provide us no option should some supply chain issues or something like that arise.
I can do that.
Is there anyone who cannot live with that moving forward?
I think it makes sense for the move forward. And for me, this is also sounding consistent for other types of motions that we've talked about over our many, many conversations together about not brand name references, right? But more about function and purpose.
Okay. Then Jessica, can you take us on to the next work group?
All right. Thank you, Raymond, for presenting.
Thank you.
And we'll go ahead and we'll move on to our last work group. We're going to circle back around. This is going to be first, but this will be Mike's potency work group update. So whenever you're ready, Mike, go ahead and bring your stuff up on the screen.
Well, I have a short little presentation today. I have had no meetings, and I do need some help from the work group before I go forward. And based on the last work group's meeting and where we were in the last task force meeting, there's still, in my mind, a little ambiguity on what's being asked of me. And so I just want a short little presentation and ask for some feedback on what exactly you want us to do in the potency work group, which is now sort of doing water testing. So start out, I'll just go through a little of, I think I didn't explain it well last time, so I'll have a little presentation on the different types of water testing. So we have water activity and moisture. Both are required tests under the current rules. Water activity is defined by the FDA. It's commonly used in food safety. And it's commonly used as relation to microbial growth. So it's used as describing how microbial growth is likely to proceed in a particular food. Moisture, all the labs are using approximation methods as far as I can tell, and that's what LCB is telling me. And that there's a different method for every lab, and there's not really any clear definition on what it should be, and there's not really clear what purpose it's being used for, and which would potentially drive what method would be correct to select. Water activity, so just to describe the difference between the two methods, water activity is really a test of the water vapor, the moisture in the air above the sample. So you put water in a cup with a little headspace and you measure how much water vapor there is, and you put the food in a cup with a little headspace and you measure the same thing. And the proportion is, you know, if it's 90% what's in the water cup, it's 90, and if it's 70% at 70, if it's the same, it's water, and so forth. So it's a proportional test to how much it is compared to just pure water. And it's used to describe the likelihood of microbial growth. So, you know, meats, fresh vegetables, fruits usually have, you know, 0.9 to 0.1 and have lots of potential bacterial growth in them. And as you go through syrups and ham and noodles to dry foods, then they're much more unlikely to have any microbial growth in them. And this is basically what water activity is used for industrially and what FDA uses it for. So it's a test on microbial growth. As you can see, it's likely that fresh fruits and vegetables are going to have pretty high water activity, which would, you know, include our cannabis samples. The difference between water activity and moisture content is water activity is really a test of the free water in the sample. That's water that's available to be evaporated and go into the pressure above it. While moisture content includes bound water and the free water. So you could have water in a sample in a thing that's bound to a protein or a sugar or a salt or something else in the product that isn't really available to evaporate, that it's being held by the product. And if you want moisture content, you would want the content of both the water that's free, as in the water activity, and in the bound water. And in order to do this, labs are using a variety of different techniques. The most common one that people are using is loss-on drawing. And what you do in loss-on drawing is you dry the sample and you measure how much mass was lost. And LCB reports that most labs are using some variation of this. And all of them with different characteristics, different times for drying, different temperatures, different oven types. You can have 100 degrees for 2 hours, or 95 degrees in a vacuum oven for 2 hours, or 100 degrees for 4 hours, or some other version of a forced air oven versus a different kind of oven, some version of how they do this test. And this doesn't detect all moisture. Some moisture will need very high temperatures to drive it off from if it's bound very tightly to some protein or sugar or salt. And it also includes other things that aren't moisture that are going to be evaporated. So, you know, other volatile compounds that might be present. On the other hand, it's easy to perform, it's inexpensive, it's commonly used in energy, it's widely used in other food types. From agricultural point of view, this is a loss-on drying test is what you would do for animal feed. It's, if you have a set procedure for it, you can do this very easily and quickly on a large number of products, and it gives you a good approximation if that's all you're looking for, and if everybody agrees on, you know, what biases they're willing to accept in their test method. Another test method people are using is an indirect test method. They're just checking for the water activity, and they're using mathematical models of assumptions on how much water activity relates to total moisture in products to say this is what the water activity of the cannabis is. So some people are just doing the water activity test and just using formulas to convert that to a approximation of the moisture. The true moisture test is the Carl Fisher test that will actually selectively test for the water molecule. And it can differentiate the water molecule from other volatile compounds. No one's doing this. It's very expensive and it has a lot of matrix issues that will obviously come up when determining with cannabis, where you have moisture activity, which is just the vapor pressure above the sample. Water activity, you'd have to get the water out of the sample, and so for different matrices have different issues. Obviously, cannabis is a novel matrix, so there would be some novel issues with cannabis, but it would be able to tell you if it is water versus some other thing. Which leads to really what the work group's problem is that we have policy questions about it that really aren't questions about analytical testing. Most of these different kinds of loss on drying methods aren't invalid. They're legitimate methods that people use in other places to do, as a moisture test. But is this what we want to do in the industry? Should everybody be doing their own method? The methods are biased against each other to some degree. Is that an issue, or is that okay? Is the degree of what we're trying to prove acceptable to that? And is this just too hard to accredit? Do we need a fixed method just for crediting, not because of the scientific value of the methods? Alternatively, do we really need moisture itself? Can we just check for water activity, which is easy to do and well-defined, or do we need to figure out how to do it at all, which is sort of the work group's first alternative, but that's really a policy question, so it's really not for the work group. Alternatively, if we knew what we were trying to prove with this method, what it's used for, maybe we could get a fit to purpose analysis and say, okay, this would solve the problem that the policy people are trying to solve best. Is it really food safety? Is it really product uniformity? Do we just need any test as long as it's valid and everybody does it just for a baseline industrial production measurement? We really weren't sure what it's for, and that might help us decide which test is best. And, do we really need to do this testing? I guess, what's its purpose? And I think I want to put that question forward because we're not really sure in the work group why we're doing the moisture testing. Nobody's really sure about it. So, but it's not a work group question, it's a policy question. So that's my little presentation. I hope that helps you understand where we are in the work group. And if we can do something, we'd like to do it, but I'm really not sure what to do. And I don't want the work group to work on a blind alley.
Hey, Mike, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
The questions you're asking about water activity, does that feel like it's more of a product standard, a lab quality standard, or an accreditation standard?
So water activity is the most well-defined of them. FD has a definition for it, and it's really a moisture test. So it's a humidity test based on a overall. So it's pretty well-defined in terms of how to test for it. And it's a food safety standard. So my default would be that this is a test on the food safety standard because that's what FDA would use it for. If it's being used for something else, I wouldn't know. I'm just guessing that's what it's for. But that would be my first guess is it's trying to say as a relation to why you're testing it for microbial activity. All you want to test for it, is it wet or not?
My recommendation here for the work group so they can continue working is go work on the water method. And LCB will take the question about moisture, like we did with biotolerant gram-negative, and provide feedback to the work group on what is the reason and what is the theme. But I think the work group can get started on water.
On water activity?
Yep.
Okay. Water activity should be pretty straightforward because EPA has pretty well defined it. So in many ways, this is one of the already apparently everybody's doing the same general thing. So that should be pretty straightforward. In terms of moisture, that was what was really challenging to the work group is it wasn't, everybody was doing something different, but there was nothing really to say that anybody was doing anything that was scientifically invalid. So it's like it felt arbitrary, and so that was a struggle.
Yep. LCB will take the question about moisture, and we'll get Mike's specific guidance on what that means for us and what is the need for us.
I don't have anything else, so this is my all I have today.
With that direction from LCB, though, does that then you've got a clear path?
Well, we'll review it, and I'm sure I can ask. If I don't, I can ask more questions from LCB if Kendra's willing to provide the answers. And
Great. Okay, I'm going to now suggest something that we don't normally do is take a break. If we could maybe take a 5-minute break before we go into our next topic, which is the report. And then we've got the report update. We've got an update on the proposed legislation, and then a public feedback session. So if we could just, Anastasia, maybe take a 5-minute break. So we would return at 2:15.
Perfect.
All back. I know that was just a short break, but at least we had one. So next we're going to talk about the report. So we're talking about our second legislative report that this task force has been working on. And we've got a fairly aggressive timeline to make our deadline. So I will let Jess take it away and walk us through that agenda item.
Absolutely. All right, so we have about an hour to talk about the report. What Sarah's going to do, she has a presentation she's going to bring up on the screen here in a moment, and she's just going to give some very high level updates on the report. And then there were two categories where there were the most, she'll kind of go through, you know, how comments and edits were integrated into the report first, and then we'll talk a little bit about how and why certain edits were rejected. And then also there were two categories where there was the most, you know, significant comments, and those were on the timeline and the proficiency testing. And we'll have two sections to talk about those two items in depth, since that's where the most significant comments were. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to bring a presentation up on the screen and take it away.
Hopefully you are seeing the screen now. Yes?
Looks good.
Okay. Okay. So let me get these things rearranged on my desktop. Okay. So yeah, today, like Jess said, I'm just going to give an overview and a debrief of the report, the edits and comments specifically. Okay, so there were 4 basic categories of edits and comments that were observed. Those were mostly edits to grammar and technical edits. There were edits providing and/or comments suggesting some clarifications. There were some narrative comments, and there were some questions pertaining to statute, rule, policy, or process. When reviewing, the reasonable grammar and technical edits were largely accepted, acknowledging that the document is still slated for publications review, which includes agency-required plain talk and technical editing for conciseness, clarity, and readability. During this time, I do work very closely with the publication staff to maintain the integrity of the report, but that does happen, and it's quite thorough. There's that. Let's see. There were minor edits providing clarity and suggestions. Those were evaluated as to whether they were first consistent with the task force recommendations and discussions. And then we also looked if they were consistent with the report section, and if the content or discussion was discussed elsewhere. And so there were several places that there was a comment, but it was actually addressed elsewhere. so some of the comments weren't accepted because of that rationale. And then there were a few items that were outside the purview of the task force, its authority, and often just outside of my authority to answer on behalf of any single agency. Again, these mostly revolved around citations or discussions of agencies' authority, statute, rules, or process. And this includes implementation of some of those pieces. In these areas where comments fell, I specifically suggested that those comments be redirected to the agency that has the current authority. In limited places, the agency that had authority or who could get the ball rolling were identified. Sorry, I lost my place here. So screen went dark for a second. Let's see, we're there. Okay. All right. So feedback we offered individuals. We provided individual responses to the people who provided comments. We offered one-on-one sessions, and we have today's debriefing. Currently, the report is with our publication specialist. And as I said before, this comprehensive process covers the agency-required plain talk, which plain talk is, just to get it, take out some of the jargon that sometimes gets clouded up in these reports and doesn't convey the message, and then consists of technical edits for conciseness, clarity, and readability. During this time, minor edits to content can be integrated, as is customary with all our publication processes. So even though we had moved it into publications, we were hearing from those individuals that requested one-on-one sessions. The publication process, contains many moving parts, and it is important that we were continuing through that process just in order to make sure that we can meet all our deadlines. The next step is a review by Ecology's Governmental Relations and the Governor's Office. And we want to note that anything that is substantial that comes out of those reviews, we would bring back to the steering committee. So one of the areas I just mentioned was the timeline. And we'd like to touch a little bit more on that. Okay. The topic of the timeline that is presented in the report displays a high-level overview of the progress of the task force and the next steps and pieces that need to follow, as shown in this image. This image exists in the report at the end of the short section titled Coordinated Actions and Accreditation Transfer. And this is about halfway through the report. This image illustrates a timeline consistent with the recommendations and demonstrating the actions that must take place in front of accreditation transfer to provide the robust accreditation desired. There are no dates placed on any of the crucial and necessary actions that need to be completed, as you can see. And this is actually consistent with publications convention, and it matches the discussion that precedes it. And finally, the structure provides to not impede or confuse simultaneous agency-sponsored legislation activities. So that is what I have for the technical contents. Are there any questions? Again, this is the perspective of the author and how I went through my process. And I have any questions to that process, I'd gladly entertain, or any other questions.
So Sarah, this is Annette. I think just for the steering committee, that the reason I think you brought up that the timeline, because there was a substantive comment, and the comment was, or the suggested edit was to put the 2024 date back in on the transfer to ecology. And so was there any follow-up discussion with you and that commenter on that, or are we just bringing that forward here to discuss that here?
There was no follow-up
Okay.
that I got, just for us to discuss it in the debrief. I sent out an email to everyone and said that we would cover that item in our debrief and
Okay.
see if there was any questions that followed.
And the rationale there, and I probably have to put my ecology hat on at the moment, was because the ecology transfer, really for it to be the tool that we want it to be, to provide the accreditation that is being asked of it, it has some it needs some tools in order to work. And those tools are those other items that don't really have dates associated with them. So the idea of not putting the 2024 date in there was to show that, that there's a logical sequence of steps necessary so that we can get where we need to go. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, the preceding section is a very short section, and it doesn't have any dates. It just talks about the things that need to be done, and it's not structured to providing the date.
Okay. And then again, with wearing my ecology hat here, when we had a fairly significant internal discussion about how to address that, and one of the options to put the date back in was to just add some caveat language about the likely outcomes should those tools that are before it not be in place. So that, I think, is what we're hoping to maybe open up to discussion. Either option, I think, is a viable outcome. So we'll just open that. If there's anyone who'd like to speak about that, or have a strong view one way or another, any steering committee members? Okay, I'm not hearing anything or seeing any hands raised. Just want to make sure people have the opportunity.
Does anyone have any comments or questions about the things that have been presented so far before we move on to talk a little bit about PT?
Okay.
All right.
Steering
Great.
steering committee hat back on, and we can move on. We can move.
All right.
Hey,
well,
just
Sarah,
give me a second, and I'll skip over to the PT slides. Just give me a second here. All right, you should be seeing the slides, and actually, I'm going to give the speaking rein over to Ryan. Please tell me to progress the slide when you are ready.
Ryan, you're very quiet for some reason.
Yeah.
I I can't hear him.
I could hear him like a whisper a second ago.
Is that better?
Not really. I heard the better, but it's very, very quiet.
Okay, give me 1 second. Let me switch my audio real quick.
We got you now. We're
Oh,
good.
okay.
I can hear you now.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. So the PT Center discussion. So we really wanted to just kind of drill down on these. Mostly because that it's a really, really critical part of accreditation. Hence why it was one of the two work groups specifically cited in the initial 2019 report. Just going over that, many in that report kind of made the statement that many of the other states that have approved this I shouldn't say many, all of them are dealing with the same level of not having, in lack of a better term, the gold standard of PTs, where you have in matrix for every, in cannabis products, not a substitute for every single test available. So the report outlined that, went into some detail about that, and specifically noted that the pesticide detection and quantification in the presence of low or no concentration of the cannabinoids is drastically different from that of pesticide testing in the presence of those cannabinoid interferences. Additionally, those provided in a solvent matrix, because at the time that was kind of one of the main PTs that were available, are essentially analytical ready and therefore don't really go through a preparation procedure. It's just kind of a standard at the time. Again, these are kind of, this section with the 2019 report was going off of what was available at the time. Some of the PTs that were available were simply a blind solvent concentration, where it's just a dilute and shoot and then report that result, whatever the concentration is. It is unknown to the laboratory, but they would report it on. The report further mentioned that it might be practicable to establish some round robin comparisons using cannabis and cannabis products under current restrictions at the time. The cannabis products and cannabis material for relevant PTs would need to come from inside the state at the time, would be most suitable for assessing potency among the laboratories as well. It might be a bit more difficult for the other contaminants, such as your pesticides or all the other things that are required. Alternatively, a state program or private company under advisement of the state might source product within the state and spike the cannabis material or cannabis products with the analytes of concern, I guess this is the word I'm struggling for, similar to what was at the time implemented by Colorado and Oregon. Colorado using at the time a state-run PT, and Oregon using a private company. This was further dived into in the early task force work, especially in the pesticide work group while working through the PDP. Excuse me, I just lost my my computer just froze on me. Anyways, working with the PDP, there was some discussion on the high THC, high CBD hybrid, discussion of the different commodities within the same commodity group when it comes to validation. And there was a lot of talk of like, well, if we have these three commodities, we'll probably need to, for that validation, need to be those PTs in those three types of commodities. After that, there was also the presentation by Phenova, who is the private company that works in Oregon since 2016 to implement their in-matrix PT program. I think at the time they were just doing pesticides, potency, and I believe residual solvents, possibly, but I know for sure it was just pesticides and potency at the time. And the representative from Phenova gave a nice presentation outlining a lot of basically how that program would work. One of the things he mentioned is one of the things they really were surprised by, maybe not that they might have been surprised by, depending on who you ask, was labs tended to perform better when they were doing a PT that was basically as close as you could possibly get to the samples they see in day-to-day basis. Then we transitioned into the PT work group that I led. We tried to get a trial run going with Ty and Finova. Unfortunately, there were some challenges that we could not overcome. Primarily, there was three major things. There was the licensing of the PT provider. Basically, this person at the end of the day is selling cannabis products and therefore needs to have a license to do so in the state. The second item was location of the laboratory. The work group made it very clear that, I shouldn't say very clear, there was a lot of discussion in the work group, and we all felt through those discussions that the best outcome was if it was held at a quote-unquote neutral site. The Department of Ag Lab was proposed, but unfortunately, due to this challenge and the previous one, that didn't come to fruition. And then the last of the major three challenges was what to do with the leftover material. And this is a little bit interwoven with the licensing thing. The material that is both leftover from the study as well as the material used for the study when purchased from the retail space goes out of the traceability system. And in order to maintain traceability of the system or of the material, when it shows up at the lab, it would have to be re-entered. And that just wasn't something we, again, without a license to purchase from a producer processor, do what he needs to do at the Department of Ag, and then send it out. There wasn't a way to maintain that traceability at the time. So that's where that fell. And we had some discussions of letting legislature know in our report that, hey, there's some hurdles if we want to implement something similar to what Finova does, whether it's run by the state or run by a third party. There are some legislative hurdles that come from not just WAC, but some from RCW as well that needed to be addressed. So next after that, Doug. So next after that would be the matrix prioritization discussion we had. PTs for these field, sorry, Sarah, if you go to the next page, please. So there we go. There was a discussion on PT matrix prioritization based on which of the current fields of testing need to have an in-matrix PT first. Potency, residual solvents, and pesticides were highlighted as critical due to that mentioned THC and other cannabinoid interference. And the rest could come kind of in the order they're listed here based on how much of an interference THC is during analysis. The advantages of this prioritization is it would give labs best information available when they're developing and refining methods for tests they don't have, or developing methods for tests they don't have, or refining and troubleshooting methods they do have when errors come up. Gives more data detailing a lab's capabilities across each analyte in each matrix, and follows recommendations set forth by the pesticide work group and the PT work and the prior motions and recommendations from the PT work group documented in the previous legislative report. Matches models in other states, as well as I'll mention Canada, but they're kind of a special case because they've federally legalized it, so they don't have that same interstate commerce barrier that we have to deal with. And lastly, it progresses towards having PTs that most accurately represent routine samples analyzed by the laboratory, which at the heart of PTs is what they are. So again, the goal of this prioritization is to outline to the legislature which methods are absolutely critical to have the PTs to determine if laboratories are capable of making this accurate, producing the accurate data. And at that, I'll go ahead and open it up to everybody else.
So Ryan, this is Annette. So so the reason that we're bringing this forward right now is because these were some of the substantial discussions that we had over the when we were looking at edits in the report. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we just wanted to remind everybody of where we're coming from and what that is entails. So so I guess then at this point we would you know, give folks an opportunity to bring thoughts forward that they wanted to share.
I mean, this is outside of the scope of us, but one of the ideas that I had talked with a few of you about was, you know, figuring out some way to give authority to research licensees to be able to sell to labs or something along those lines so that they could potentially create proficiency testing solutions.
Thanks for out of the box thinking there, Jeff.
Oh, this is Amber. It's just, I like this prioritization slide that we're seeing here. Is this in any way, trying to figure out how to word this. Could this be integrated into the Department of Ecology's requirement? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to ask is the requirement that all of these tests are in Cannabis Matrix still standing, or is there the possibility of the Department of Ecology taking these, say, critical ones and moving forward with their accreditation, and then the secondary list, you know, is potentially later or something like that? Or is the Department of Ecology still requiring that every single one of these tests needs to be in Cannabis Matrix?
So I'll take a stab at that, and let me put on my ecology hat again for that part. So thanks for that question. The way that I am reading this, and the hat that I'm wearing is as the program manager where the accreditation unit lives. So the way that I am reading this is that for in order to accredit for potency, pesticides, and residual solvents, the PT must be in Matrix. Otherwise, there won't be a pathway for accreditation for those analytes, if that's the right term. For the ones on the right, the secondary ones, when I look at the cannabis task force, and Ryan, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but the way that I understood the task force recommendations is that it would be ideal to be in Matrix, but a surrogate could still, the interferences and the things that we learned about when we were talking about this, there could still be a surrogate alternative for that list until the in-matrix was available. I mean, eventually we would like to move everything to that gold standard.
Great, thanks for that clarification. And then one more small clarification. We are still scheduling like a brainstorming session about how to figure out the in-state PTs. Is that correct?
We haven't been able to schedule that yet, but we'll get back to you and on the scheduling part.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other comments or thoughts anyone would like to add?
I just want to second Amber's statement there. I'd be eager to see when that will be scheduled as well.
Great. Okay, then with that, I think if there aren't any other questions to discuss, then Jessica, how did we want to walk through the proposed legislation update?
Right. So this is just a standing item at this point, since we know that we have legislation related to the work of the task force that's ongoing. And so we thought it would be good if we could have Kendra provide an update, and then if you and Jen have any updates on any of the legislation, if anything's happening there.
Okay, well, I can go ahead and start. I'll just do a quick update. I think the last steering committee we had talked about a proposal that we were leading, Ecology was leading to amend the timeline on the data transfer to be more in line with the development of those tools that we talked about in that figure, so that we wouldn't get the cart before the horse. So that legislation, we did some stakeholder outreach for that legislation, and we weren't able to garner enough support for it to move forward this year. So we did not put that. We're not moving forward with that this year.
And if you'd like, Annette, I'll pick up the second half that we've talked about together. So in regarding the interagency cooperative team, that legislation is moving forward. That work right now, the draft has been drafted between LCB and the Department of Agriculture. There was a public comment period on kind of the first version of that draft, recognizing it was a really short public comment period in August. And with that feedback, there's been some additional edits made. Versions have been shared between the agencies involved. And so I think we're actually getting pretty close to having what we think is a package, a viable kind of tool for what the conversations we're going to be having in session. And all plans are that come the 2022 session start in January. That particular bill will be in the mix as agency-sponsored legislation to, one, make an official transfer for lab standards authority to the Department of Agriculture, and also under that bill create the ICT. So all things are moving forward. We are on the track to have that being considered in session starting in January.
And Kendra, let me just say, I just think that legislative package that is moving forward is just such a great example of the agencies working together really well to get to move something important forward. I just it just gives me a nice warm heart to know that to see the good government at work.
Yep. Thank you for that reflection. It took a lot of work to get there. Lots of moving parts for different agencies and process, but it's on its road for sure.
Yes, I know it seems like an easy thing, but it's not. It involved the task force as well. I think it really shows how well this task force has worked. We started out with kind of a blank slate. We created recommendations. Thanks to Mike and Ag for helping us get through that first year with pesticides and plants, and I think that really shaped a lot of implementation steps that we needed to have in place to move this effort forward in a super positive direction. And now this is the next implementation step, and I just think it's just great to see it working so well. Okay, open it up for questions.
Yeah, I think those are the only two packages we've talked about that probably warrant an update here.
I think that's correct.
What?
Let me I'm just checking the list to see if anybody's unmuted or wants to say anything or speak here.
Yeah, this is Bobby at Confidence again. we saw a draft of the Department of Health's request for FTEs, and it kind of got us wondering what type of staff each agency is hoping to have. I saw that the Department of Health is looking for 5 full-time employees, and we haven't seen the request from other agencies, and I'm curious about that.
For LCB, we're not requesting 5, but we're definitely requesting like a part of an FTE connected to management, right? Back to the agency for the work that's going to have to go on, and new subject matter experts in the chemist classification. Last I've seen for ours, maybe it was 2.5, and I can validate that. The other agency that would be involved would be Department of Agriculture, and I'll just share most of that other work is happening at the policy level. So I know we had reflected that Brad White's not on the call today. So I would just share that I can probably take that back with Kelly McLean, who has been our contact on this project over at Department of Agriculture, and see what else I can source for folks.
Thank you.
And maybe that's a less of a steering committee type discussion. Maybe you can just have that discussion directly with the agencies of interest.
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay.
It might be nice to know that definitively, just for transparency.
I do believe the legislative process has a lot of transparency built into it. So I mean, there will be fiscal notes that will be attached to each, where money is being or resources are needed, and they should provide a lot of clarity for that. So if you don't have it now, you will have it in the process. Okay, well then with that, I think we can move to, we are quite a bit ahead of schedule, but that's not the first time. And I'm sure it was such a nice afternoon, I'm sure everybody wouldn't mind getting their afternoon started differently. So Anastasia and Charlene, can we move on to our public feedback section?
Yes. So our attendees, our public attendees, if you have any feedback that you would like to speak with now, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. And if your hand is not working, then maybe you can put something in the chat and I'll unmute you. We'll give it a few minutes for that. Okie dokie, we do have one. Michael McCutcheon. Sorry if I badgered that. There you go, you're unmuted.
Hey, thank you. So I just have a couple of comments. I appreciate being able to attend and listen to what you guys are working on. It's informative and I think important. The only comment that I have is earlier on you guys were talking about methods and equipment, and in particular a type of agar that's a specific brand. And I definitely, in our own facility that I work in, which is separate from the cannabis industry, I see supply chain issues as a huge problem. And I think, if you guys are tying yourselves down, meaning the industry, to a specific brand of product, it's going to be problematic. So I think that really needs to be addressed. I understand the concerns about consistency, and that is also a problem. But if laboratories can't get a particular brand of material, then the whole thing falls apart. So I think that's it's critical to be able to have options that can be validated, and I think addressing it through validation is probably the way to do it. I think that was my only other comment or thought. So again, thank you guys for doing this. It's important.
Thanks for that, Michael. Any others? Looks like we have a few comments in the chat too, which are good to see. Okay then. With no other public feedback, let me thank everybody for their time, and especially our public partners who have stuck with us through thick and thin and through all of our meetings. We are getting close to reaching our end here, which is we're not there yet, but appreciate everyone's participation and all the input, and feel like we're in a good place. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you at the next steering committee meeting.
Thanks, bye.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day, everybody.